Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob O'Donnell. I'm an independent consultant here in New York City. I mostly do Ruby and Python, some Objective-C. Been an Emacs user for about 10 years, and today I'm going to talk to you about Emacs macros. So let's start with, can everyone read this fine?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Even from here.
All right, great. So what is a macro? A macro is a way to record your keystrokes and play them back. While you are defining your macro, you are also executing it for the first time. So let me start off and give you a quick introduction to doing a macro. So I'll get to the actual commands I'm running in a second. But so if I just type some letters, hit enter, and the macro, I can repeat it over and over. So that's what I'm talking about with the macro. Macros excel at text manipulation tasks. They tend to be for pretty disposable tasks. Usually I will use them because they're very fast to write. And if you're good with them and you've practiced them, then usually you can do a lot of tasks very fast. On the other hand, they're not extremely fast. So if you're trying to do a macro over a giant file like 500 megs or something, they have no progress bar. So if you just kind of try and hit it and go get a cup of coffee, it can be kind of frustrating because you never really know like where is it in the file. Most of the things you do with macros, you can actually do using other commands. Replace string, replace regex. Of course, elisp, snippets often too. elisp is going to be more powerful than anything you can do with a macro because it is a programming language where macros are really just, it's recorded text. So you can't do something like look at the file name and print something different based on that. It's really just playing back your keystrokes. Unless, of course, you're calling a function that prints the file name, then it will work. Snippets also, like if you want to do something like, let's say if you have like your class and you want, whenever you go into like a Ruby file and you type class, rather than create a macro for this, you're probably better served using a snippet, like snippet. So I'm going to go over the basic macro commands. There is, and I'm going to go ahead and try a couple of them in this other buffer here. The basic command to start a macro, there's actually two of them. You can either use Control-X, open parenthesis, which starts recording. It calls the literal function kmacro start macro. And at that point, anything you type, including like functions, are being recorded. So again, I'll type hello. And then when you want to end your macro, you can call Control-X end parenthesis. This macro I just recorded, I didn't put a new line. So when I run it with, when I rerun the last macro, which you can do with Control-X-E, the K macro end and call macro. And then after you've evaluated it once, you can keep typing E to repeat it. And it will repeat over and over and over. The F3 and F4 versions are a little bit different. Oh, geez. Is that going to work? Okay. They're a little bit different because they are overloaded. They, depending on the context, will do something else, where F3, if you're currently recording a macro, it's going to insert the counter, which is a command we'll get to. And F4, if you've already ended your macro, it's going to call the macro again. It's the same thing as doing Control-X-E. So I personally prefer these commands, partly because they're older and I'm used to them. I also like that I don't really have to move my fingers off the home row that much, where these ones involve more. But you can pick whichever ones you like. And I do like having that counter in there. But the Control-G, keyboard quit. While you're defining a macro, you're going to see at the bottom of the screen def, or actually at the bottom of the buffer, I forget what that's called.
menu buffer?
The menu buffer. You'll see the def in the far right, and that lets you know you're in the middle of recording a macro. And when you hit Control G, oddly, I've noticed that the def doesn't go away until your next command, but it's currently canceled.
I meant status bar.
Status bar?
Sorry, mini bar is buffer's a thing underneath. That's
Sure.
status bar.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me.
So you can also append to the end of the last macro if you start with the universal argument. So let me actually do this hello one again I did before. So if I wanted to, if I realized, oh, I made a mistake, I want that new line on there. You can start with, I actually, it's Control U. I have it rebound to Control J, but Control X, open parenthesis, and then, did I do that wrong? Oh, shoot, I did that wrong. Where is it? All right, sorry about that. Hello. This is probably not the first time I will screw up. So, do universal argument, Control X, and now you can see at the bottom there it says appending to the macro. I hit enter, I close the macro, and so I've appended that last bit to it. And finally, there's apply macro to region lines, which lets you kind of apply a macro to every line in a region, which you can also do by kind of repeating the macro. But as in, like, let's say I want to add hi to the beginning of this. I can just end it here, where typically, if I want to have hi at the beginning here, I kind of have to move the mark down to the bottom, into the beginning of to the beginning of the line of the next line, so that when I repeat the macro, it, at the end of the macro, it brings it back and kind of resets its state, so you can keep on calling it over and over. Where with this apply macro to region lines, you can just kind of end it in the middle of the line, and then call it over that. And so that kind of the apply region to macro kind of automatically adds that next line and beginning of line. And then I think I also want to mention that when you're, let me bring this back. If you want to repeat for infinity, when you call the last macro, you can give it the universal argument of 0, and that's going to keep on repeating the macro until it hits an error. So if I do universal argument of 0 and Control X 8, looks like something terrible has happened. Which, okay, I think the macro I had was not the macro I expected. Right, yeah, because I just had, that's right, yeah. So let me try that again. If I start defining hi, enter, move to the next line. And now let me try the meta J, 0, Control X 8. The first time I had just, the macro was just hi space, so it was just adding hi for infinite amounts of time, which is also quite useful. So those are the macro basic commands. And really, you can do a lot with just these, just the first couple. Like, these are the ones I use like 90% of the time, and they save me a lot of time when I'm doing, often the type of things I'm doing are kind of like, I've got some data here and I'm trying to put it into a SQL statement or something. So I'm kind of grabbing data from maybe one data source, maybe two data sources, and kind of just aggregating them into one line. So next I'm going to sort of talk about a couple quick tips that you should think about when you're writing macros, because macros actually can be a little bit tricky to write. So the first one I want to talk, the first two I'm going to say, and then show you an example. Where the first one is be careful using the movement commands, and in general you want to prefer to search. And then the other one is look for patterns that should hold true every time. So what I say, The reason those two will kind of bite you is naively, let's say in this bottom example here, I want to, let's say on the left of that hash, I have a product, and I want to put the product at the end of the images with a PNG after it. So naively, I start at the beginning of the line, hit tab, and I just sort of do forward word because I see, while I'm executing it, hey, that's what I need. Next, I move to the end of the line and move back two. And then I yank and put a PNG. So, and then I sort of get it set for the next iteration of my macro by moving it to the next line. I could have also used the apply region to macro. So I run it once, looks good again. Uh-oh, my first problem. And I have a couple problems here. One, at the end of this line, there's a space. So when I just went back, to the end of line and moved back to, that's not going to cut it because I've got an error here. And then the other problem is, I just sort of used forward word, which is not going to catch this type of thing. So the way that you can usually write macros to be a little more robust is using the search command. So like before, I'll tab to the beginning because I'm certain that every time that's going to put me in the right place. I'll start to mark, and I'll use the search command and search for the colon. So in this case, I know that there's never going to be a colon inside my symbol. So I move back, and again, I'll search for images, forward, kind of get my place, do .png. So now when I run it, works a lot better. And then for these two tips, one I often do is I break my macro apart into multiple steps because what I'll find is I'll try and do some sort of complex macro where I'm pulling some data from here and some data from here and trying to insert it into one sort of final output. And somewhere in there, I'll make a mistake. And it'll be very frustrating because I've sort of carefully tried to record 40 keystrokes or something. And I've made a mistake in there somewhere where it's broken. And this goes hand in hand with that tip where you want to make sure to end the macro in the same state as the beginning so it's repeatable, as I was saying before. So I'll give you a quick example here where, let's say in this case, what I'm trying to do is grab the name and grab the price and separate them with a comma. So I certainly could try and grab, in one macro, kind of get to the name, grab this bit, and then get to the price, grab this bit, put it into the final output. But often it will take me less time because I won't make mistakes to kind of collect the different things in different outputs. So I'll make a temp buffer name, start my buffer here, search again, do search for, that's like a pretty safe string. I'm probably not going to run into that anywhere I don't expect to be. Once I get here, start the mark, search for the end string. Again, like if you think inside this, you might have a single quote, then that's not going to be a safe thing I just did. In that case, you might want to move to the end of the line and then search backwards for a quote. So then over here, paste it, enter, bring it back. And so now I've got this kind of in a repeatable state where this buffer here on my right, which is collecting my names, I've got correctly on the next line. This one here, when I search again for name, it's not going to pick up the first one and get me into an infinite loop. So I should be able to run this over and over. So there are those. And then I'll collect the prices. That is some code that I was working on, so let's not do that one. Again here, I will search for price. And so right here, what I searched for was pretty specific, where the syntax of Ruby, you don't need those spaces. So if you were pretty unsure that it would always be in that format, and sometimes there might or may not be spaces there, you would probably want to use search, I forget the exact command, but regular expression, search forward. So you can make those spaces optional. So then, I mean, I'm going to be naughty here. I copied to the end of the string instead of searching for the comma, but that's okay. Paste it here. And then, so now I have kind of these two buffers with all my data, and I'll create a third one. And then this one I will put the output. So before I start the macro, I'm going to kind of get these buffers in the right state. I'm going to get them to the beginning of the line, beginning of the buffer, beginning of the line, so that they're ready to iterate over. So now I'm going to start. You got to be careful when you do. Where I'm often doing this type of macro, where I've got kind of different inputs and different buffers, and my macro is kind of rotating through the different buffers. So what I so you got to be careful that after each iteration you've left all your buffers in the right state. So I'm going to start the keyboard macro. I've started in my output buffer. I'm going to jump to this one, grab it, move down one, move back. So it's ready for the next iteration. Paste this here, put a comma, and then move to this one. Same thing, down, back, and finally enter. And so now I'm pretty certain I can see that my mark is in the right place in all the different buffers, and it's ready to repeat. So when I repeat it, kind of pulls all that stuff in there. So yeah, I often do it that way. I mean, you certainly could have done this in one macro, but often you're trying to be faster here. You're trying to take a shortcut by doing this, and if you're messing with the macro over and over and over, then you're not saving a ton of time. So usually it's fastest for me to split it up into a couple of like very hard to screw up macros. And now I'm going to go over some of the final commands. All these commands, by the way, you can find all this in the Emacs info. If it's like in the Emacs section in the macro, there's a couple that I skipped, but very few, maybe 3 or 4. So if you're curious about all of them, then you can definitely check it out there. And there's also a lot more documentation about how these work. So there is the keyboard macro ring, like the kill ring. It's it kind of keeps your last macros in a ring. By default, that number is 8. So when you execute a new macro, it will cycle off the last 8th one, and they kind of wrap around. So the keys, pretty much all the key bindings for macros are all gathered under the Control X, Control K. What's the name for the command grouping? Or I forget exactly, but yeah, key map. So Control X, Control K, and then N. And you can see on the bottom, that's probably pretty tiny, but you can sort of see it's cycling through my different ones. And then P, which, so it's N and P, which are standard keybacks, Emacs commands for going back and forth. And then when you find the one you're looking for, you can hit Control K. And actually, while you're doing that, while you're kind of in that mode, you can just keep hitting Control N and Control P. You don't need to repeat the whole sequence once you're kind of in there. Same with Control K. The keyboard macro counter. So this is pretty interesting. This is useful, especially when you're trying to deal with like IDs or something. You're generating some sort of sequential number. Basically the insert counter. Let me show that off very quickly. Control X, Control. Whoops, I did the wrong thing. Control X, Control I. So you can see it sort of will loop through each iteration of the counter is going to increment it by 1. So there's actually a bunch of different ways to control that. There's a set counter, which you normally want to do before you start your macro. And that's the initial state of the counter, which by default is 0. But you can have it start at whatever you want. add counter is basically if you want to like skip some numbers. So if instead of incrementing by 1, you want to increment by 3, so it goes like 0, 3, 6, 9. You can set the add counter to 3. Set format takes a format string, which is basically it's the same format that you would use for like the message elisp command. I'm not extremely familiar with all the different permutations. I know by default it's %d, which is just your average decimal. So if you give it %x, this is hexadecimal. So if you want to loop through doing the same thing with hexadecimal, then you can do that by setting the format. And then, as I mentioned with the F3 command, which is the overloaded start command, that's so if, I just did it with F3, and now that I'm recording, if I do it again, then it inserts the counter. So that's kind of a shortcut, and it also makes it easier that you have to remember less commands. So naming and saving keyboard macros. You can name your keyboard macros with Control-X, Control-K, N, and it's going to ask for the name for the last keyboard macro, which in this case is a counter, I suppose. So we'll call it counter. And now that it's named, it is actually an Emacs function, so you can evaluate it right there. You can also call it from your command X. So I guess it makes it an interactive function. You can bind it to a key, which is Control-X, Control-K, B. So this says bind last macro to key. So you can either give it a full path here of keystrokes, or by default, Control-X, Control-K, 0 through 9, and capital A through capital Z are all reserved for keyboard macros. So you can give it a shortcut here and just provide it the last bit. So I'll say capital I or capital C, I guess. So now when I call Control-X, Control-K, capital C, it calls my macro. And finally, I believe this one doesn't have a binding by default. There's insert KBD macro, where you have to give it a name. So you already have to have named this function for this one to work. And this spits out a little bit of elisp that you can put into your Emacs list file or anywhere else you might want to save this macro and reuse it later. And finally, there is editing keyboard macro commands.
So I guess you could also take it the other way around and make up your own macro this way in Lisp.
Yeah, you could. You could. You'd probably be better served writing some Emacs Lisp at that point. But, I mean, particularly when you have numbers in here, I think that they're like the keyboard mappings. Like it's not very human parsable. But you definitely could write your macros using Lisp. And I would call you a guru at that point.
Or better yet, take your macro and then call this within another Lisp program to add some functionality you couldn't easily do with just the macro.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Probably more practical.
Okay, so editing a keyboard macro, Control-X, Control-K, Control-E. So this is actually very useful. Let me enlarge the text there. This basically lets you kind of come in here and at this point, I'm kind of editing normal text, and I can kind of insert whatever I want here. So if I want to put like an ID at the beginning of this, so it's going to be like ID : space number. I can just go ahead and insert it here, and I believe the space is like this, and then it tells you up here, press Control C to finish. So I'm going to do that, and now. When I call that macro, you can see that it's edited it. And so that's actually extremely useful because, as I've said, like often it's very easy to make a small mistake in a macro. You can edit a name macro, Control-X, Control-K, E, and then the name or like the shortcut. So if I kind of provided, I always get this one wrong. Let's see if I can Control X, Control K. All right, whatever. You can pass it a name. You can pass it your keyboard binding, and it'll kind of go into that same editing sequence for that named one rather than the last one you've executed. And finally, there's the K macro step edit macro, which lets you kind of edit a macro while it's being evaluated. So let's say I've got, let me start a macro. Hello, whoops. So now I just define that macro, Control X, Control K, space. So this command is actually pretty great, but at the same time, I don't like it as much because kind of like git commit -I, like it's got a ton of these little different options that you need to remember to really know how to work it. So I mean, I basically know the simplest ones, which are you hit space to, as you can sort, well, I don't know if you can see, but I don't think I can make that bigger, but the cursor's over the first letter of the macro, which is H. So I can hit space to sort of say, go ahead, that's fine. And I'm going to do that a couple times. But then I get to, I've made 3 spaces here and backspace twice because I only wanted 1. So if I kind of want to correct that, then you can hit D to delete the space, D to delete the space. I'm going to leave this space and then get rid of the 2 deletes. And then if I want to like sort of add a character here, I can say capital I to insert in the middle of it. So we're going to go to whoops and then C to finish it off. So that's basically it. There's not a ton to macros. And again, really, if you can master these first couple commands and start to see where it's useful to apply macros, you can really gain a lot of like little productivity here and there. So at this point, I have on that's not it. Emacs-macros.herokuapp.com. I have a couple of problems that you can work through. You'll see in there problem 1, problem 2, problem 3. And you can just go in and copy them over to Emacs. And if the instructions aren't clear or anything, let me know and I'll help you out. And that's that.
I just want to, one thing that always gets me with keyboard macros, because I'm very fast to Control G.
Yeah.
Control G kills the macro that you're working on. So when you're doing a macro, be careful, even if you think to Control G, just like, oh, my search is wrong, just sort of work your way back and try to keep going.
Yeah, and how do you actually, because that happens to me often, is like I'll be in a search and I'll go, oh shoot, I didn't mean to search. And I'll hit Control G and now I've lost my macro.
Yeah, you'll have to start again. If I think about it, it's like, oh, that search was wrong. I hit enter and I try, like I'll go back to the beginning line and try again. Because the macro, if I could edit it later, or it's just like, yeah, it doesn't matter if it goes like 4 times over the same place, as long as the outcome's.
Yeah, but that going back and forth is going to be repeated and has to be.
Yeah. As long
Well,
as
depends
it's
how many
reasonable.
times it'll be repeated.
Right.
Yeah.
As long as it's like, if I'm searching for the colon, I went too many colons, then I go back to beginning line, search again.
Yeah, and that's also a good, like you can, if you make a mistake in a macro, you can often recover. And often, if you're not doing a huge data set, having mistakes in your macro, as long as you've recovered, it's
In other words,
fine.
it will take you more time for repeating that versus the time to write the other macro.
Right. Yep.
You were saying about the macros sort of locking things up. There's like a progress bar thing you can use, right? So it's like a badly written macro. Is that right?
No, well, I don't think so. I mean, as far as I know, there is no progress bar. As in, like,
Tell me, you're screwed. There's no progress bar thing?
no, you can Control G, and it takes like 5 seconds, 10 seconds to kind of get control again. But no, there's no percentage or anything. It just keeps executing until you stop it or until it hits the end of the file.
Or until it goes past your undo buffer limit.
Oh, really?
But I'm not
Uh-huh.
No, not on purpose, but it's always like, oh, you can't undo this either.
Oh,
The
yeah.
thing about smaller macros, you can just hit undo, and it undoes at the macro level what you did.
But isn't there a macro command that lets you do progress bars and push? There is, I just looked up online.
Yeah, and that, not the part of everyone's use, the part of general usage.
Okay.
If there is, that I would be interested in it. All right.
Great.